The photograph sits within a simple wooden frame, slightly yellowed at the edges, a portrait from 1907. A little girl, no older than 7, with solemn eyes staring directly into the camera. Her hair is neatly parted and pulled back with a ribbon, her lace-collared dress immaculately pressed. In her arms, she cradles a porcelain doll, its painted face bearing an eerie similarity to her own. For over a century, this image has remained just another antique photograph, forgotten in the depths of a university archive. Until now. Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. Today, we uncover the chilling story behind an innocent photograph that has remained hidden for over a century. Spring, 1907. The small mining town of Blackwood Valley was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The coal mines were producing record yields, and the wealthy mine owners lived in opulent mansions that overlooked the town. Among them was the Harrington family, whose patriarch, Edward Harrington, had built an empire from coal and timber. Blackwood Valley was a town of stark contrasts. While the mine owners lived in luxury, the miners themselves endured grueling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, returning home to cramped company housing with little ventilation and poor sanitation. Children as young as 10 worked as breaker boys, separating coal from rock with their bare hands, their lungs gradually blackening from the constant coal dust. The air in Blackwood Valley was perpetually hazy with coal smoke, the buildings coated with a fine layer of black soot that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. Even the snow in winter fell gray upon the miners' section of town. The miners' quarters consisted of long rows of identical wooden houses, each divided into 4 cramped apartments. A family of 6 might share 2 small rooms, with no running water and only a coal stove for heat and cooking. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, with tuberculosis, pneumonia, and typhoid claiming lives every winter. The company doctor would make his rounds once a week, offering little more than basic remedies and advice to get more fresh air. A cruel irony to those who spent their days in the suffocating depths of the mines. Edward Harrington's mansion stood atop the highest hill in town, its white columns and manicured gardens visible from every corner of Blackwood Valley, a constant reminder of the vast divide between the haves and have-nots. Edward had inherited a modest mining operation from his father and, through what the local papers called shrewd business acumen, had expanded it into the dominant enterprise in 3 counties. The mansion, built in 1898, was modeled after southern plantations, with 26 rooms, a ballroom, conservatory, and extensive stables. The grounds included an artificial lake, imported Italian fountains, and gardens tended by 5 full-time groundskeepers. While the miners lived and died by the ton of coal they extracted, Edward Harrington had never set foot in a mine shaft. His hands were smooth and uncalloused, his complexion ruddy from fine brandies rather than coal dust. He was known to boast at his weekly poker games that he could run his business without ever having to smell the mines himself. To Edward, the miners were merely a line item in his ledgers, a cost to be minimized like any other. Edward's wife, Catherine, came from old money, the daughter of a Boston banking family who had reluctantly agreed to the match. Theirs was a marriage of convenience rather than love. Catherine had brought connections and refinement. Edward provided wealth and status. By all public appearances, they were the perfect couple, hosting elaborate dinner parties and making generous donations to the local church. But behind closed doors, theirs was a cold union. They maintained separate bedrooms, and the staff noted that days could pass without the couple exchanging more than perfunctory greetings. Catherine had been raised in Boston high society, educated by private tutors in literature, music, and the arts. The daughter of a progressive family, she had expected to attend Radcliffe College before her father's financial reversals forced her into marriage with the nouveau riche coal baron. In Blackwood Valley, her education and sensibilities found little outlet beyond her charitable work and the raising of her daughter. The local society matrons viewed her with a mixture of envy and suspicion, never fully accepting the outsider with her Boston accent and progressive ideas. The staff often overheard Catherine's arguments with Edward about the treatment of the miners. She had established a small school for the miners' children and a clinic that offered basic medical care, initiatives that Edward tolerated only because they enhanced his public image. When Catherine proposed improved housing for the workers, Edward had coldly reminded her that her allowance came from the very profits she seemed so eager to reduce. Edward's only daughter, 7-year-old Eleanor Harrington, was the apple of his eye. She wanted for nothing: the finest clothes imported from Paris, the best tutors brought in from New York and Boston, and exquisite toys ordered from the most renowned European craftsmen. But of all her possessions, Eleanor cherished one above all others, a porcelain doll named Victoria, crafted by the renowned German doll maker Heinrich Müller. Eleanor was a quiet, observant child with a seriousness that unsettled the household staff. Unlike other children of her status, she showed little interest in the elaborate parties her parents hosted, preferring to sit in corners with her doll, watching the adults with her penetrating blue eyes. The local children were forbidden from playing with a coal baron's daughter, and the children of other mine owners lived too far away for regular companionship. As a result, Eleanor had grown unusually attached to her doll, treating Victoria as her confidant and constant companion. Despite his indulgence of Eleanor's material wants, Edward was a distant father. He would pat her head when passing in the hallway, bring her expensive gifts after business trips, but rarely spent meaningful time with his daughter. It was Catherine who read to Eleanor each night, who listened to her lessons, who brushed her hair before bed. The bond between mother and daughter was uncommonly close, forged in the relative isolation of their gilded cage. Müller dolls were coveted throughout Europe and America for their lifelike features and exquisite craftsmanship. Each doll was handmade, with glass eyes imported from Venice, human hair wigs, and porcelain fired in Müller's proprietary kilns. A Müller doll was not just a toy but a status symbol, costing the equivalent of 3 months' wages for the average coal miner. The dolls were so valuable that they were typically displayed in glass cabinets rather than played with, making Eleanor's constant handling of Victoria all the more unusual. Heinrich Müller had begun his career as a humble pottery maker in Nuremberg before discovering his talent for crafting dolls. By 1900, his workshop employed 30 master craftsmen, each specializing in a particular aspect of doll making, one for the porcelain firing, another for the glass eyes, another for the delicate facial painting. Müller dolls were known for their haunting expressions, which seemed to change subtly depending on the light and angle. Collectors often reported feeling as though the dolls were watching them, an optical illusion created by the precisely crafted glass eyes. Victoria had been given to Eleanor on her 5th birthday. Unlike most children who quickly tired of their toys, Eleanor's attachment to Victoria only grew stronger with time. Servants reported that the girl would not take meals without the doll seated beside her, would not sleep unless Victoria was tucked in alongside her, and would become inconsolable if the doll was removed for cleaning or repairs. Eleanor had even created an elaborate personality and backstory for Victoria, claiming the doll was a princess in hiding from enemies who had overthrown her kingdom. The household staff indulged this fantasy, addressing the doll as Your Highness when speaking to Eleanor. This intense attachment had concerned Catherine enough that she had consulted Dr. Bennett about it. The doctor had dismissed her worries, suggesting it was merely a phase that Eleanor would outgrow. Besides, he had added, it was better than having a wild, unmanageable child running through the house. Edward had been even more dismissive, telling Catherine to be grateful for a quiet daughter who didn't disturb his peace with noise and chaos. The photograph we're examining today was taken on April 17, 1907, by visiting photographer Thomas Whitaker, who had been commissioned to capture portraits of the town's most prominent families. Whitaker was known for his technical precision and artistic eye, having studied in Paris before establishing his studio in Philadelphia. For the Harringtons, this would be the last family portrait ever taken. The photographic session had been tense from the start. Edward, irritated by a labor dispute at the Western mine, had nearly canceled the appointment. Catherine had insisted they proceed, arguing that postponing would mean Whitaker might not return to Blackwood Valley for months. Eleanor had been unusually fretful that morning, clinging to Victoria and refusing to wear the new dress her father had selected. Only Catherine's gentle persuasion had convinced the child to sit for the portrait, and even then, Eleanor had insisted that Victoria be included in the photograph. Whitaker had set up his equipment in the Harrington Conservatory, taking advantage of the natural light streaming through the glass ceiling. The photographer had positioned Eleanor on an ornate chair, instructing her to sit still for the long exposure time required. Catherine stood beside her daughter, while Edward positioned himself behind them both, his hand resting possessively on his wife's shoulder. The formal family portrait had been completed first, followed by individual portraits of each family member. Eleanor's portrait with Victoria was the last to be taken, as the child was growing increasingly restless. 3 days after this photograph was captured, a devastating fire swept through the Harrington mansion. The official report stated that the blaze started in the kitchen from an unattended stove. The flames spread rapidly through the wooden structure, engulfing the entire mansion within hours. The fire was so intense that nearby trees were scorched, and windows in neighboring houses shattered from the heat. The fire had begun shortly after midnight, when the household was asleep. By the time the alarm was raised, the central staircase was already engulfed in flames, cutting off escape for those on the upper floors. The staff, who slept in the separate servants' quarters behind the main house, were awakened by the cook who had stepped outside for a late cigarette and noticed the flames. Their attempts to enter the mansion were thwarted by the intensity of the blaze. The heat so severe it blistered their skin from 20 feet away. By morning, the once grand home was reduced to smoldering ruins. The local volunteer fire brigade had been powerless to contain the inferno, their horse-drawn water wagons and primitive pumps woefully inadequate against the ferocity of the blaze. Edward Harrington, his wife Catherine, and little Eleanor all perished in the flames. The funeral was held 3 days later, with the closed caskets containing what remains could be recovered from the ashes. The entire town attended, the mine owners expressing shock and sorrow, the miners maintaining a respectful silence that masked their more complicated feelings toward their deceased employer. Edward's younger brother Herbert, a banker from Philadelphia, arrived to settle the estate and take control of the mining operations. Herbert, eager to distance himself from his brother's controversial reputation, implemented several of the safety improvements the miners had long requested, or so everyone believed. The photograph of Eleanor and her doll was thought to have been lost forever, along with all the family's possessions. Yet somehow it survived, finding its way into the archives of Westmore University, where it remained cataloged but unexamined for decades. The journey of this photograph from the ashes of the Harrington mansion to the university archives remains something of a mystery itself. According to the sparse documentation, it was donated in 1952 by an anonymous benefactor along with several other photographs from Blackwood Valley. The donor requested that the collection be preserved, but made no mention of its significance. The archivist who received the donation noted only that the materials arrived in a package postmarked from Melbourne, Australia, with no return address. The collection was catalogued as early 20th century American photography, coal mining regions, and placed in storage. For 72 years, the photographs sat in acid-free storage boxes, occasionally viewed by researchers studying early 20th century photography techniques, but never scrutinized for the secrets it might hold. Its true significance remained hidden, much like the story of the little girl and her doll. Fast forward to January 2024. Dr. Amelia Parker, professor of historical photography at Westmore University, was leading a digitization project of the university's extensive photographic archives. Her team of graduate students had been methodically scanning thousands of photographs dating back to the late 19th century. Dr. Parker, a tall woman with prematurely silver hair and penetrating gray eyes, had developed a reputation for her meticulous attention to detail and her almost uncanny ability to extract historical narratives from seemingly mundane images. The daughter of a detective and a librarian, she had combined her parents' professions into her own unique specialization, using photographs to solve historical mysteries. Dr. Parker specialized in forensic photography analysis, having previously worked with law enforcement agencies to extract hidden details from historical crime scene photographs. Her work had helped solve several cold cases, including the infamous Davidson murder of 1962, where her enhancement of background details in a family photograph had revealed the identity of the killer. In that case, a mirror in the background had captured the reflection of the murderer preparing to enter the room, an image so small and blurry that it had been overlooked for decades until Dr. Parker's enhanced digital scan revealed it. The digitization project was part of a broader initiative to make historical artifacts accessible to researchers worldwide. Using state-of-the-art scanning technology, the team was creating high-resolution digital copies that could reveal details invisible to the naked eye. The scanner, a custom-built device that cost the university nearly $500,000, used multispectral imaging to capture details beyond the visible spectrum, including faded ink, erased pencil marks, and even fingerprints left on the photographs decades ago. The university archive contained over 3 million photographs, with thousands more added each year through donations and acquisitions. The team had been working for 18 months and had digitized barely 10% of the collection. They focused primarily on the oldest and most fragile items, which were at risk of deterioration despite the climate-controlled storage conditions. Late one evening, as the rest of the team had gone home, Dr. Parker was reviewing the day's scans when she came across Eleanor's photograph. The archive room was silent except for the soft hum of computers and the occasional rumble of the heating system. Outside, snow was falling gently on the Gothic Revival buildings of the campus, creating a sense of isolation and timelessness that suited Dr. Parker's work. There was something about this particular image that caught my attention. The composition was fairly standard for Edwardian portraiture, but the little girl's expression seemed unusual. Children in photographs from this era typically appear stiff and formal due to the long exposure times. But Eleanor's gaze held something different, an awareness, an intensity that seemed beyond her years. Dr. Parker had encountered hundreds of photographs of children from this period. Most showed either a blank, slightly confused expression or an artificial smile prompted by parents or photographers. Eleanor's expression was neither. It conveyed a complex emotion that seemed out of place on a child's face. There was wariness there, a guardedness that suggested knowledge beyond her years. Intrigued, Dr. Parker decided to enhance the digital scan, increasing the resolution to examine the details more closely. She applied a series of specialized filters designed to bring out subtle variations in tone and shadow that might be invisible to the naked eye. The university's advanced image processing software, originally developed for astronomical photography, allowed her to isolate and enhance specific elements of the image without distorting the overall picture. What she discovered would send shockwaves through the historical community and rewrite the tragic story of the Harrington family. I was primarily focused on the photographic techniques used, the lighting, the composition, but as I zoomed in on the doll, I noticed something reflected in its glass eyes. The porcelain doll's glass eyes, due to their curved surface, had inadvertently captured a reflection of the room behind the photographer. And in that reflection, barely discernible even with modern technology, was the image of a man standing in the doorway, partially obscured by shadow. The phenomenon wasn't entirely surprising to Dr. Parker. In her years of analyzing historical photographs, she had encountered several instances of accidental reflections capturing details outside the photographer's intended frame. Victorian and Edwardian photographs were particularly prone to such accidents, as photographers of the era were still mastering the technical aspects of their craft and often overlooked reflective surfaces in their compositions. It's a phenomenon known as accidental reflection capture. Glass surfaces, especially curved ones like doll eyes or spectacles, can act as crude mirrors. Photographers today are aware of this and careful to avoid unwanted reflections. But in 1907, such technical considerations weren't always top of mind, particularly when working on location rather than in a controlled studio environment. As Dr. Parker enhanced the reflection, adjusting contrast and sharpness to bring out details, the figure in the doorway became more distinct. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. His stance was not that of a servant waiting for instructions or a household member casually observing the photographic session. There was tension in his posture, an alertness that suggested purpose. At first I thought it might be the photographer's assistant, but something about the posture, the way the figure was positioned, it suggested someone trying to remain unseen. The figure appeared to be monitoring the photographic session rather than participating in it. Most concerning was what appeared to be in the man's hand, an object that reflected light differently from his clothing, suggesting a metallic surface. Though small in the reflection, the shape was distinctive enough to raise Dr. Parker's concerns. Dr. Parker consulted with Dr. Marcus Reed, a forensic photography expert from the Criminal History Department. Dr. Reed had spent 20 years with the FBI's Photographic Analysis Unit before joining academia, and was renowned for his ability to extract information from compromised or degraded images. His work on historical crime scene photographs had helped identify several previously unknown victims of serial killers, bringing closure to families who had wondered about their missing loved ones for decades. What Amelia showed me was extraordinary. The doll's eyes had functioned like a primitive surveillance camera, capturing what was happening behind the photographer. After applying several enhancement algorithms specifically designed for curved reflective surfaces, we could make out distinct features of the figure, and, most disturbingly, what appeared to be a weapon in his hand. Dr. Reed applied additional enhancement techniques, including a new algorithm developed for analyzing distorted reflections in curved surfaces. The process required several hours of computing time, but the results were striking. The enhanced image revealed a man with a stern expression, watchful eyes focused on the scene before him, and in his right hand, partially concealed by his jacket, was unmistakably the grip and barrel of a revolver. We could determine that the object was approximately 6 to 8 inches in length, with a metallic sheen consistent with a revolver from that period. The stance of the figure suggested someone on alert, possibly providing security or surveillance. The presence of an armed man watching a family portrait session raised immediate questions. Who was he? Why was he armed? And what connection might this have to the fire that claimed the Harrington family just 3 days later? But this was just the beginning. As Dr. Parker and Dr. Reed delved deeper into the Harrington family history, they discovered newspaper archives that painted a more complex picture than the simple tragedy that had been recorded. The university's digital newspaper archive contained publications from across the United States dating back to the early 19th century. While major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post had been fully digitized, smaller local publications often existed only on microfilm or in original print copies. The team expanded their search to include labor publications, mining industry journals, and small-town newspapers from the region around Blackwood Valley. The prominent newspapers of the day had portrayed Edward Harrington as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, philanthropist, and devoted family man. His obituaries spoke of his generous contributions to the town's church and school, his support of the local orphanage, and his reputation as a fair employer. The Philadelphia Inquirer had described him as a man of vision who brought prosperity to a forgotten corner of our state, while the New York Tribune praised his modern approach to industry and community building. However, Dr. Parker's team uncovered a different narrative in smaller local papers and labor publications of the era. These painted Edward Harrington as a ruthless businessman who had systematically eliminated competition through questionable means. Former competitors had suddenly sold their mining operations to Harrington at suspiciously low prices after experiencing accidents or financial setbacks. The Miner's Voice, a labor publication with limited circulation, had directly accused Harrington of sabotaging a competitor's mine shaft, causing a flood that rendered the operation unprofitable and forced the owner to sell. Reports in these alternative publications suggested he had been involved in dubious business practices, forcing smaller mine owners out of business and exploiting his workers. Several miners had died in accidents that some claimed could have been prevented with proper safety measures that would have cut into Harrington's substantial profits. The Workers' Herald had published a detailed analysis of safety violations at Harrington mines, noting that the death rate was nearly double the industry average. The same publication had interviewed widows of miners killed in Harrington's operations, all of whom reported receiving minimal compensation and being evicted from company housing within weeks of their husbands' deaths. The team discovered records of a miners' strike in 1906, just a year before the fatal fire. The strike had been brutally suppressed by private security forces hired by the mine owners, with Harrington reportedly taking the hardest line against the workers' demands for safer conditions and fair wages. Photographs from the strike showed armed guards confronting miners and their families, with one particularly disturbing image capturing the aftermath of a confrontation where several miners lay bloodied on the ground while guards stood over them with clubs. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, notorious for its anti-labor activities, had maintained a significant presence in Blackwood Valley during this period. Records indicated that Edward Harrington had been one of their largest clients in the region, employing multiple agents to infiltrate labor organizations and report on union activities. The man in the reflection might well have been one of these Pinkerton agents, tasked with monitoring the Harrington family as well as the miners. But most significantly, the researchers discovered a series of anonymous letters to the editor published in the weeks before the fire, threatening to expose Harrington's alleged crimes. The blood of honest men stains Harrington's gold. His wealth is built on graves, and justice will not sleep forever. The day of reckoning approaches for those who profit from suffering. Another letter, published just 10 days before the fire, was even more explicit. Harrington believes himself untouchable behind his mansion walls, but no fortress can protect a man from his sins. The evidence of his crimes exists, and soon all will know the truth of how he built his empire. The letters had been dismissed by the mainstream press as the ravings of disgruntled employees or labor agitators, But read in conjunction with the other evidence the team had uncovered, they took on a more ominous tone. Someone had been preparing to expose Edward Harrington's crimes, and that someone may have had evidence substantial enough to threaten his empire. These discoveries led Dr. Parker's team to question the official narrative of the fire. Was it truly an accident, or could it have been something more sinister? Arson committed either by vengeful miners, business rivals, or even someone within the Harrington household itself. The timing is certainly suspicious, Dr. Reed observed. Anonymous threats to expose crimes, followed days later by a fire that conveniently destroys any evidence that might have existed in the Harrington home. It's a pattern we've seen in other historical cases where arson was used to cover up crimes or destroy incriminating evidence. The team expanded their investigation, searching for any records related to the fire investigation. They discovered that the official inquiry had been remarkably brief, with the coroner's inquest lasting less than a day, and calling only 3 witnesses: the fire chief, the Harrington's gardener who had spotted the fire, and Dr. Bennett, who had identified the remains. No forensic experts had been consulted, and no questions had been raised about the coincidental timing of the threats and the fire. Armed with this new context, Dr. Parker returned to the photograph with renewed focus. This time, she turned her attention to Eleanor herself. I began to notice subtle details I had missed before. The girl's knuckles were white from gripping the doll so tightly, and her eyes, they weren't just solemn or intense, they were fearful. Dr. Parker had worked with child psychologists on previous cases involving historical photographs of children. She consulted with Dr. Sarah Linwood, a specialist in childhood trauma, sending her the enhanced image of Eleanor without providing any context. Dr. Linwood's assessment was immediate and troubling. This child is exhibiting signs of acute anxiety. The tension in her posture, the grip on what appears to be a comfort object, and particularly the expression, these are consistent with a child who feels threatened or unsafe. There's a vigilance in her gaze that children typically only develop in response to persistent danger or instability in their environment. Children in portrait photography from this era were typically instructed to sit very still and maintain a serious expression. Smiling for photographs wasn't common practice until later decades, but Eleanor's expression went beyond the usual formality. There was tension in her posture, anxiety in her eyes. Dr. Parker compared Eleanor's portrait with dozens of other children's photographs from the same era. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Where other children looked bored, confused, or artificially posed, Eleanor looked afraid. Her eyes seemed to be looking slightly past the camera, perhaps at the armed figure reflected in the doll's eyes. But the most chilling discovery came when Dr. Parker examined the doll more carefully. The doll was clearly expensive, a high-quality German porcelain, but there was something unusual about the way it was constructed. The head seemed slightly disproportionate to the body, and there was a nearly imperceptible line around the neck that suggested the head was separate from the body. Using the enhanced scan, Dr. Parker could see a thin seam where the doll's head joined the body. This wasn't unusual in itself. Many dolls had detachable heads to allow for cleaning or repair. But there was something off about the alignment, suggesting the head had been recently removed and not properly reattached. Dr. Parker consulted with Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a historian specializing in Victorian and Edwardian toys and artifacts. Dr. Montgomery had written the definitive text on European doll-making traditions and had curated exhibitions of historical dolls for museums worldwide. Her expertise had been sought by collectors, museums, and even law enforcement investigating art theft and forgery cases involving antique toys. The doll in the photograph is indeed a Muller creation, very valuable even in that era. Heinrich Müller was known as the Doll King of Nuremberg, and his creations were coveted by wealthy families throughout Europe and America. This appears to be from his royal collection, which featured interchangeable wigs and eyes. Dr. Montgomery examined the high-resolution scan, zooming in on various details of the doll's construction. She noted the distinctive painting style of the face, the particular shade of bisque porcelain that was Muller's trademark, and the style of clothing that matched catalog descriptions from the period. However, this particular model had a unique feature. The head was designed to be unscrewed to allow for changing of the wig or cleaning. What's unusual in this image is that the head appears to be slightly misaligned, suggesting it had recently been removed and replaced. Dr. Montgomery pointed out the telltale signs of misalignment, a slight gap between the head and body on one side, and an overlap on the other. To the casual observer, or even to the photographer in 1907, this would have been barely noticeable. But to an expert examining a high-resolution scan, it was unmistakable. You can see here that the seam doesn't quite match up. Whoever reassembled it either did so in haste or wasn't familiar with the proper alignment mechanism. Muller dolls had a specific notch system to ensure perfect alignment of the head to the body. This observation led to a startling hypothesis. Could the doll have been used to hide something? To test their theory, the research team created an exact replica of the Muller doll based on catalog descriptions from the era and surviving examples in museum collections. They confirmed that the hollow head could indeed have concealed small objects. The replica doll, crafted by a master doll maker specializing in historical reproductions, was as close to the original as possible given the available information. When the head was unscrewed, it revealed a surprisingly spacious cavity approximately 3 inches in diameter and 2 inches deep. These dolls were essentially hollow inside. The porcelain was thin but sturdy, creating a sizable cavity within. The head cavity alone could easily hold jewelry, documents, or other valuables up to the size of a small pocket watch. The team conducted experiments to determine exactly what could be hidden inside such a doll. They found that several folded documents, small valuables such as rings or coins, or even a small vial could fit comfortably within the head cavity. The brilliant aspect of using a child's doll as a hiding place is that it would likely remain with the child at all times, Dr. Parker noted. Even if someone were searching for hidden items, they might not think to examine a toy, particularly one that a child was known to be deeply attached to. Meanwhile, another member of the research team, historical detective Jonathan Hayes, had been digging deeper into the circumstances surrounding the Harrington fire. Hayes had spent 15 years with Scotland Yard's Historical Case Review Unit before joining Westmore University as a consultant on the digitization project. His specialty was re-examining historical deaths, initially ruled accidental or natural that might actually have been murders. The official report stated that all 3 family members perished in the fire, with remains identified by their family doctor, Dr. William Bennett. But I found something odd in the coroner's preliminary notes, which were never included in the final report. Hayes had obtained the original coroner's notes through a Freedom of Information request to the county records office. The handwritten notes, nearly illegible in places and water-damaged in others, contained observations that were conspicuously absent from the typed final report. The coroner had noted discrepancies in the sizes of the remains attributed to Eleanor. They appeared to belong to a child several years older and larger than the 7-year-old girl. The coroner wrote, and I quote, "Skeletal remains attributed to the Harrington child appear inconsistent with reported age. Femur length suggests an individual of approximately 12-14 years of age. Yet this observation was omitted from the final report, which simply confirmed the identities as provided by Dr. Bennett. This discrepancy raised immediate red flags for the investigation team. If the remains identified as Eleanor's actually belonged to an older child, what had happened to Eleanor herself? And who was the older child whose body was found in the mansion? This led me to investigate Dr. Bennett himself. I discovered that he had been employed by the Harrington Mining Company as their company doctor, responsible for treating injured miners and determining when they were fit to return to work. Financial records showed he received a substantial salary beyond what was typical for a rural physician of that era. Hayes uncovered evidence that Dr. Bennett had frequently cleared injured miners to return to work prematurely, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. In one particularly egregious case, he had certified a miner with a respiratory condition as fit for duty, only for the man to collapse and die underground the following day. More concerning was the discovery that Dr. Bennett had been the sole medical examiner to identify the remains after the fire. No independent verification had been sought, despite the severe condition of the bodies making visual identification impossible. The doctor had claimed familiarity with the dental work and skeletal characteristics of the family members, allowing him to make a positive identification. This led me to a shocking possibility. What if Eleanor Harrington didn't die in that fire? What if the remains identified as hers belonged to someone else entirely? And if so, what happened to the real Eleanor? The team's investigation took an unexpected turn when they discovered a previously overlooked detail in the photograph. In the background, barely visible on a side table, was a small calendar. Dr. Parker had nearly missed this detail herself. It was only when examining the enhanced scan for the 3rd time, looking for any additional context clues, that she noticed the small desktop calendar partially visible at the edge of the frame. The calendar was the type commonly found in Edwardian households, with tear-away pages for each day and enough space on each page for brief notes. When we enhanced this section, we could make out the date, April 17, 1907. But more importantly, we could see handwriting on the calendar. By using advanced imaging techniques, we were able to decipher what appeared to be the words "midnight train" written on the square for April 20th, the very night of the fire. The writing was faint and would have been invisible to the naked eye, particularly in the original photograph. But the digital enhancement, combined with specialized software that could reconstruct partially visible text, revealed the notation clearly. Someone in the Harrington household had made note of a midnight train on April 20th, the very night their home would burn to the ground. This discovery prompted Hayes to investigate train schedules from 1907. Accessing historical railroad archives required special permission, but given the potential historical significance of their research, the Eastern Railroad Historical Society granted the team access to their preserved timetables and passenger manifests. I confirmed that a midnight train departed from Blackwood Valley to New York City on April 20th, 1907. It was part of the Eastern Seaboard Line, which connected the mining regions to major cities along the East Coast. The midnight train was primarily used for freight, but also carried a small number of passengers. It was not a popular choice for travelers due to the inconvenient departure time and slower speed compared to the daytime express trains. This made it an ideal choice for someone wishing to leave town without attracting attention. The train would have arrived in New York approximately 14 hours later, providing connections to ships departing for Europe and other international destinations. In 1907, New York was the primary gateway for international travel, with dozens of steamship companies offering passage to Europe, South America, and increasingly to more distant destinations like Australia and Asia. Passenger manifests from that era are incomplete, but I did find a record of a Mrs. Wilson and daughter boarding that train. No other information was provided, which was unusual for the time. Typically, the manifest would include at least a first initial and a destination, but in this case, those fields were conspicuously blank. The manifest showed only 5 passengers boarding at Blackwood Valley that night: an elderly couple returning to Philadelphia, a man listed as a traveling salesman, and the mysterious Mrs. Wilson and her daughter. The lack of information about the Wilsons stood out among the more detailed entries for the other passengers. What's particularly interesting is that the ticket was purchased 3 weeks before the departure date. This suggests premeditation rather than a spontaneous journey. The advance purchase indicated planning and foresight. Someone had intended to take that train well before the events that would unfold on the night of April 20th. The timing aligned perfectly with the notation on the calendar in the photograph. As the team pieced together the fragments of evidence, a new narrative began to emerge, one very different from the historical record. They believed that Catherine Harrington had discovered her husband's criminal activities and feared for her and her daughter's safety. The threatening figure reflected in the doll's eyes may have been one of Edward's business associates or hired men, monitoring the family. Perhaps Catherine had already found incriminating documents, or had witnessed something she wasn't meant to see. Whatever the case, she appeared to have been planning an escape. Catherine had likely planned their escape for weeks, possibly hiding valuables or documents incriminating her husband inside Eleanor's beloved doll, the one possession she knew her daughter would never part with, and the one item unlikely to be searched. The midnight train note suggested a planned escape on April 20th, but something must have forced them to accelerate their plans. To corroborate their theory, the team sought out additional evidence from the Harrington household staff. Most had long since passed away, but they discovered that one former housemaid, Mary Sullivan, had given an oral history interview to the Blackwood Valley Historical Society in 1972 when she was in her 80s. The interview had been conducted as part of a project documenting the daily lives of service workers in the early 20th century. Sullivan, who had worked as a housemaid for the Harringtons from 1905 until the fire, had been one of the few staff members who lived off the property, residing with her sickly mother in town rather than in the servants' quarters. This fortuitous arrangement had saved her life on the night of the fire. In the recorded interview, Sullivan mentioned something that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on new meaning. Mrs. Harrington was acting strange those last few weeks. Very jumpy, always watching the doors and windows. She'd take the little girl and that doll of hers into her private sitting room and lock the door for hours. I heard them whispering sometimes like they were practicing something, and twice I caught her looking through Mr. Harrington's private papers in his study when he was away at the mines. Sullivan's observations aligned perfectly with the team's theory that Catherine had discovered incriminating evidence and was planning an escape. The locked door sessions with Eleanor might have been preparation for their flight, teaching the child about their new identities or explaining why they needed to leave. The night before the fire, she asked me the strangest thing. She asked if I still had family in Boston and if I'd ever thought of leaving service. Said a woman with my skills could find better positions in the city. Almost seemed like she was suggesting I should go. I often wondered if she somehow knew what was coming. This comment was particularly telling. It suggested that Catherine might have been trying to protect the housemaid, encouraging her to be elsewhere when whatever she had planned was set in motion. Dr. Parker's team theorized that the fire was no accident. It was either set deliberately by Edward himself to eliminate evidence of his crimes, not realizing his wife and daughter had already fled, or it was set by Catherine as a diversion for their escape. The fire starting in the kitchen is consistent with a deliberate arson designed to look accidental, Hayes noted. Kitchen fires were common in that era, with open flames and combustible materials in close proximity. It would be the most plausible cover for an intentional blaze. But if Catherine and Eleanor had escaped, where did they go? The midnight train would have taken them to New York, but from there, the trail seemed to go cold. If they were fleeing from a dangerous situation, they would likely have changed their names and tried to establish new identities, Dr. Parker suggested. They might have left the country entirely given the resources and connections Catherine would have had through her Boston family. The team's breakthrough came when they expanded their search to international records. If Catherine was fleeing from a powerful and potentially dangerous husband, she would likely want to put as much distance as possible between them. In 1907, that would mean crossing an ocean. We focused on English-speaking destinations that would have been accessible by steamship from New York in April 1907. The most likely candidates were England, Canada, and Australia. We cross-referenced passenger manifests from ships departing New York in late April with immigration records in those countries, looking for a woman and child traveling under the name Wilson. The search was painstaking, involving thousands of records across multiple countries. The team employed pattern-matching algorithms to identify potential matches, then manually verified each possibility. After weeks of searching, they found what they were looking for in the Australian immigration records. The most compelling evidence was yet to come. The team's breakthrough led them to trace immigration records to Australia from 1908, where they discovered entries for a Catherine Wilson and her daughter Ellen, aged 8, arriving in Melbourne aboard the SS Pacific Star. The SS Pacific Star was a steam-powered passenger ship that made regular voyages between New York and Australia, with stops in South America. The journey took approximately 6 weeks, with passengers enduring cramped conditions and the perils of ocean travel in an era before modern safety regulations. First-class passage would have cost nearly $300 in 1907 currency, a substantial sum that would have required significant financial resources. The physical descriptions matched what we know of Catherine and Eleanor Harrington. Catherine was described as 5'4", with brown hair and blue eyes. Ellen was described as small for her age, with brown hair and unusually intense blue eyes, a description that matches Eleanor in the photograph. And interestingly, their listed place of origin was New York, not Blackwood Valley. The immigration records included basic physical descriptions and brief background information. Catherine Wilson was listed as a widow, aged 32, with skills in teaching and household management. Her daughter Ellen was described as being in good health, with no distinguishing marks or features beyond her striking blue eyes. The timing is also significant. They arrived in Melbourne in January 1908, approximately 9 months after the Harrington fire. That would have given them time to travel from Blackwood Valley to New York, possibly stay there for a period to establish their new identities, and then book passage to Australia. This timeline aligned perfectly with their theory. Catherine and Eleanor could have escaped on the midnight train, reached New York and spent time there arranging their passage to Australia. They might have needed to wait for the right ship, or perhaps they stayed with Catherine's relatives until they felt safe to travel further. But why Australia? The team had a theory about that as well. Australia would have been an ideal destination for several reasons. It was far enough from the United States to make pursuit difficult. It was English-speaking, and most importantly, it was experiencing a period of growth and opportunity, particularly in Melbourne. A well-educated woman like Catherine could find employment as a teacher or governess, and the distance would make verification of references nearly impossible. Australia, in 1908, was still developing its identity as a nation, having federated its colonies into a single country just 7 years earlier. Melbourne was a prosperous city, benefiting from the gold rushes of the previous decades and developing a reputation as a center of culture and education. It would have offered the perfect blend of opportunity and anonymity for a woman seeking a fresh start. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Dr. Montgomery, the toy historian, recalled a collection of antique dolls that had been donated to the Melbourne Historical Society in the 1970s by an elderly woman named Ellen Wilson. When Dr. Parker mentioned the Australian connection and the name Ellen Wilson, I immediately made the connection to a remarkable doll collection I had studied during a sabbatical in Melbourne in 2015. Among the dolls was a Muller porcelain doll matching the exact description of the one in Eleanor's photograph. The donation records indicated that it had been in Ms. Wilson's possession since childhood and was her most treasured possession. Dr. Montgomery had photographed and cataloged the collection as part of her research on the global distribution of European dolls in the early 20th century. She still had her notes and images, which she shared with the team. The Muller doll in the Melbourne collection was indeed strikingly similar to Victoria, with the same style of dress, hair, and distinctive facial features. What struck me at the time was the excellent condition of the doll, despite its age. Most dolls that have been actually played with show signs of wear, chips in the porcelain, worn clothing, damaged hair. But this doll was remarkably pristine, suggesting it had been preserved rather than played with. I remember thinking it was unusual for a child to treat a toy with such reverence. The pristine condition suggested that the doll had been treasured and protected, perhaps because it represented more than just a childhood toy. If it had indeed been used to transport valuable documents or evidence, its preservation would make perfect sense. It was a link to their past and the key to their new identities. The research team contacted the Melbourne Historical Society, who confirmed they still had the doll in their collection. Intrigued by the potential historical significance, the Society agreed to examine it for any hidden contents that might have remained undiscovered for over a century. The examination of the doll would need to be conducted with extreme care, given its age and historical value. The Society assembled a team of conservators specializing in antique toys and artifacts who would use non-invasive techniques before attempting any physical examination. We've had this doll in our collection for nearly 50 years, but no one ever thought to check if anything was hidden inside. The donor, Ms. Wilson, was quite specific about how it should be displayed, always in its original clothing, and the head was never to be removed. We assumed it was just the sentimentality of an elderly woman toward a childhood treasure. The conservators first examined the doll visually, noting the exceptional craftsmanship and the nearly perfect condition of the porcelain, clothing, and hair. They then proceeded to more advanced examination techniques, beginning with X-ray imaging to see if anything was concealed within without disturbing the artifact. Using non-invasive imaging techniques to avoid damaging the antique, the conservators first confirmed that there was indeed something inside the doll's head. The X-rays revealed several folded objects that appeared to be documents. We could also see what looked like a small book or diary. At that point, we knew we needed to open the doll to retrieve these items, but we wanted to do so in the most careful way possible to preserve both the doll and its contents. The X-ray images showed several densities within the doll's head that were consistent with paper documents. There appeared to be multiple folded sheets, as well as a small bound object that was likely a diary or notebook. The conservators were astonished that these items had remained undiscovered for so long, preserved within their porcelain vault. With utmost care, the conservators unscrewed the doll's head, a process that took nearly an hour due to the age and fragility of the porcelain. They used specialized tools designed for antique restoration, applying gentle, consistent pressure to avoid cracking or damaging the delicate material. The head eventually came free, revealing its hollow interior and the treasures it had protected for over a century. What they found inside the doll sent shockwaves through the historical community. Concealed within the hollow porcelain head were several folded documents, financial records showing Edward Harrington's embezzlement from his own company, evidence of bribes paid to local officials, and most damning of all, a list of miners who had died in his operations, along with notes indicating how safety measures had been deliberately ignored to increase profits. The documents had been carefully folded to fit within the confined space, with the most important information positioned to avoid the fold lines. They had been wrapped in waxed paper, likely to protect them from moisture, which explained their remarkable preservation. The ink remained legible, the paper intact despite the passage of time. These documents would have been explosive in 1907. They proved that Edward Harrington was directly responsible for at least 15 deaths due to negligence and corruption. There were detailed records of how much money he saved by ignoring safety inspectors' recommendations, alongside the names of officials he had bribed to look the other way. The financial records showed systematic embezzlement from the Harrington Mining Company, with funds diverted to personal accounts under false names. There were ledgers documenting ghost employees, non-existent workers whose wages went directly to Edward. Other documents showed inflated supply costs, with the difference pocketed by Edward and his accomplices. One document was particularly damning, a letter from the state mine inspector warning of imminent danger due to inadequate ventilation and support structures, dated just 2 weeks before a collapse that killed 7 miners. Next to it was a receipt for a consulting fee paid to the same inspector, after which the warning was withdrawn. The inspector's letter detailed specific safety hazards at the western mine, including unstable support beams, inadequate ventilation that allowed dangerous gas buildup, and electrical wiring that posed fire risks. The letter concluded with a recommendation that the mine be closed until these issues could be addressed. Yet just 1 week later, the same inspector had certified the mine as safe, following receipt of a $500 consulting fee, equivalent to roughly $15,000 in today's currency. But there was one more item hidden within the doll, a small diary, its pages filled with Catherine Harrington's elegant handwriting. The diary was bound in red leather, approximately 3 by 4 inches, with CH embossed in gold on the cover. It contained entries dating from January 1907 to April 21, 1907, written in a neat, educated hand. The early entries discussed mundane household matters and concerns about Eleanor, but by March, the tone had changed dramatically. The diary entries revealed the full story. Catherine had indeed discovered her husband's crimes and feared he would silence her. The figure in the doorway during the photograph session was one of Edward's associates, instructed to monitor the family's movements as Edward had grown suspicious of his wife's behavior. March 30, 1907. I have found the proof of Edward's crimes at last. Hidden in the false bottom of his desk drawer were all the documents I needed. The bribes, the falsified inspection reports, the list of men who died while he lined his pockets. My God, how did I not see the monster I had married? I must get Eleanor away from here before he discovers what I know. The entry described Catherine's accidental discovery of the hidden compartment while searching for stationery. She had been horrified by the contents, realizing that her husband was not merely unscrupulous but actively criminal in his business practices. The entry expressed her fear not only for herself but for her daughter, should Edward discover that she had found his secrets. April 10, 1907. Edward grows more suspicious by the day. He has instructed Mr. Kellerman to watch us whenever he is not at home. I caught Kellerman listening at my door yesterday. I dare not speak openly to Eleanor about our plans, but the poor child senses something is wrong. She clings to Victoria more than ever. Perhaps the doll can be useful to us in a way Edward would never suspect. Kellerman was identified elsewhere in the diary as Edward's head of security, a former Pinkerton detective who had been hired to monitor labor organizers but had gradually taken on a more personal security role for the Harrington family. Catherine described him as cold-eyed and always watching, noting that Eleanor was particularly afraid of him and would hide whenever he entered a room. April 15, 1907. I have secured our passage on the midnight train to New York for the 20th. From there we will take the SS Pacific Star to Australia. My cousin Margaret has a friend in Melbourne who can help us establish ourselves there. I have sold my mother's jewelry piece by piece over the past month to afford our journey. Tonight I will place the evidence inside Victoria. Eleanor never lets the doll out of her sight, so it will be our safest hiding place. Catherine had clearly been planning her escape meticulously, arranging for funds, transportation, and contacts at their destination. The entry indicated that she had chosen Australia specifically because of a connection there, her cousin's friend, who could help them establish new lives. The decision to hide the documents in the doll showed remarkable foresight, using her daughter's attachment to Victoria as a security measure. The diary confirmed that Catherine had indeed started the fire herself as a diversion after drugging her husband with laudanum in his evening brandy. She had arranged for a servant girl's body to be placed in Eleanor's bed, a tragic but calculated decision that would ensure their freedom. April 19, 1907. E grows more dangerous each day. He knows I have found the documents. I caught him searching my room yesterday. We cannot wait until the 20th as planned. We must leave tomorrow night. Eleanor will carry Victoria with her as always. He will never think to look inside her beloved doll. God help us if we are discovered. The urgency in this entry suggested that their situation had become critical. Catherine's abbreviation of Edward's name to simply E indicated a psychological distancing from her husband, perhaps a necessary step in preparing herself for the drastic actions she was about to take. I have made the most terrible arrangement with Mary, the scullery maid. Her daughter Lily, who is nearly Eleanor's size but several years older, has consumption and is not expected to live much longer. For a sum that will allow Mary to leave service and start anew, she has agreed to bring Lily to Eleanor's room after I administer the laudanum to Edward. May God forgive me for what I must do, but I cannot allow my daughter to remain in this house of horrors. This shocking entry revealed the truth behind the coroner's observation about the remains belonging to an older child. Lily, the scullery maid's daughter, had been placed in Eleanor's bed to create the impression that Eleanor had died in the fire. The ethical complexity of this decision was evident in Catherine's plea for divine forgiveness, even as she justified her actions as necessary for her daughter's safety. The final entry was dated April 21, 1907, written aboard the train to New York. We are safe for now. Eleanor sleeps beside me, Victoria clutched in her arms. The papers report the fire has claimed the entire Harrington family. We are dead to the world, and in this death, we find our chance at life. Tomorrow we board the ship to Australia. Eleanor will become Ellen, and we will leave the ghosts of Blackwood Valley behind forever. This entry confirmed the success of their escape and their plans to adopt new identities. The reference to newspaper reports indicated that their deaths had been accepted without question, providing them with the clean break they needed to start anew. I carry the burden of what I've done, and the knowledge of what Edward did. Someday, when it is safe, the truth must be known. The families of those miners deserve justice, even if it comes too late for those poor men. Until then, Victoria will keep our secrets. Catherine's concern for justice for the miners, even as she fled with her daughter, revealed her moral compass. She had not merely escaped for her own safety, but had taken evidence that might someday bring justice to those harmed by her husband's actions. The doll, Victoria, had become not just a hiding place but a symbolic keeper of truth. The researchers were able to trace the rest of Catherine and Eleanor's lives through public records in Australia. Catherine never remarried and worked as a school teacher in Melbourne until her death in 1946 at the age of 72. Eleanor, now Ellen Wilson, became a nurse and served with distinction during World War I, receiving commendations for her courage in treating wounded soldiers near the front lines. Catherine had established herself as a teacher at the Melbourne Ladies' College, where her refined Boston accent and extensive education made her a respected figure. School records described her as reserved but dedicated, with a particular talent for inspiring girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. She lived modestly in a small cottage near the school and was known for her charitable work with widows and orphans, perhaps a form of atonement for the circumstances of her escape. After the war, Ellen established a children's clinic in a working-class neighborhood of Melbourne, providing medical care to families who couldn't afford private doctors. Former patients remembered her as a kind but intensely private woman who had a special gift for calming frightened children. The clinic, which operated from 1920 until Ellen's retirement in 1962, served thousands of children from Melbourne's poorest neighborhoods. Ellen was known for never turning away patients who couldn't pay, often accepting payment in the form of food, handmade items, or simple gratitude. Her particular focus was on respiratory diseases, perhaps influenced by her knowledge of the miners' children in Blackwood Valley who had suffered from coal dust-related illnesses. Ellen lived until 1982, passing away at the age of 82. She never married or had children of her own, but was known in her community for her charitable work with orphaned children. Her obituary in the Melbourne Herald described her as a guardian angel to generations of Melbourne's children, but made no mention of her early life or origins. She maintained the Catherine Wilson identity her entire life. Dr. Parker noted, "There's no indication that she ever revealed her true origins to anyone. Her mother's secret became her own, carried for 75 years until her death." Most remarkably, the team discovered a photograph taken in Melbourne in 1957, showing an elderly woman in her late 50s, Ellen Wilson, holding the very same Muller doll from the 1907 photograph. The occasion was the 50th anniversary of her arrival in Australia, though the photographer would have had no idea of the significance of that date. The photograph had been published in a local community newsletter celebrating the 40th anniversary of Ellen's clinic. The accompanying article described her as a beloved fixture of our community and mentioned her inseparable companion, the antique doll she has treasured since childhood. The article noted that children visiting the clinic were allowed to see but not touch the doll, which sat on a special shelf behind Ellen's desk. In the 1957 photograph, Ellen's face shows the lines of age, but her eyes still hold the same intensity seen in little Eleanor's gaze half a century earlier. And the doll, Victoria, appears virtually unchanged by time, still keeping her secrets until the moment was right for them to be revealed. The comparison between the 7-year-old Eleanor and the 77-year-old Ellen was striking. Though separated by 7 decades, the same determination and watchfulness remained in her expression. Life in Australia had clearly been kinder to her than life in Blackwood Valley might have been, but she had carried the experiences of her early years with her throughout her life. The story of Eleanor Harrington is ultimately one of survival. This photograph, which at first glance shows only a solemn child with her doll, actually captured a pivotal moment in a dramatic escape from abuse and danger. The doll that seemed merely a child's toy was in fact the vessel that carried the evidence that would have destroyed her father and ultimately secured her and her mother's freedom. As for Edward Harrington, historical records indicate that his business empire collapsed shortly after his death when irregularities in his accounts were discovered during probate. With no heir to take over the business, creditors moved in, and the Harrington Mining Company was dissolved. The mines were sold at auction, broken up among several buyers, including a cooperative formed by the miners themselves. The financial irregularities had come to light when Herbert Harrington, Edward's brother, had attempted to take control of the business. Bank examiners had discovered the embezzlement and fraud, though without the documents Catherine had taken, they never knew the full extent of Edward's crimes. The scandal had been significant enough to make national news, with the New York Times running a story titled "Coal Baron's Empire Built on Sand," that detailed the financial collapse. In a twist of poetic justice, the miners of Blackwood Valley formed a cooperative that purchased the mines at auction for a fraction of their value. Under their management, safety became the priority, and the Blackwood Valley Miners Cooperative instituted reforms that became a model for the industry throughout the region. The cooperative had implemented every safety measure that Edward had rejected as too costly. They installed improved ventilation systems, reinforced support structures, and provided proper equipment for all workers. The accident rate dropped dramatically, and productivity actually increased as healthier, more secure miners worked more efficiently. Within 5 years, the cooperative was producing more coal than the mines had under Harrington's ownership, while maintaining a safety record that was the envy of the industry. The irony is that Catherine's escape with the incriminating documents ultimately achieved what she had hoped for: justice for the miners and their families. When Edward's corrupt practices came to light after his death, it led to a congressional investigation into mine safety throughout the region. The Harrington case was directly cited in the drafting of the Coal Mine Safety Act of 1910. The act had established the first federal safety standards for mining operations, requiring regular inspections, minimum ventilation requirements, and emergency procedures. Though limited by today's standards, it had represented a significant step forward in protecting workers' lives and had saved countless miners from the fate suffered by those who had died in Harrington's operations. The researchers also discovered that Ellen Wilson had made anonymous donations to a fund for the families of miners killed in Blackwood Valley accidents. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing until her death, these donations totaled the equivalent of over $2 million in today's currency. The donations had been made through a Melbourne law firm to a trust established for the miners' families. The trust provided educational scholarships for the children of deceased miners, ensuring they could escape the cycle of poverty and dangerous work that had claimed their fathers. Over the decades, hundreds of children had benefited from these scholarships, many going on to careers in medicine, law, education, and engineering. She never revealed her true identity, but through these donations, Eleanor Harrington tried to make amends for her father's crimes. She couldn't bring back the dead, but she could ensure their families were cared for. It was her way of closing the circle. The photograph of Eleanor and her doll now resides in the Melbourne Historical Museum, displayed alongside the actual doll and the documents it concealed for decades. A small placard tells the remarkable story of a mother's courage, a child's resilience, and the secrets hidden in plain sight for over a century. The exhibition, titled Victoria's Secret, A Doll's Tale of Escape and Justice, has become one of the museum's most popular attractions. Visitors are particularly moved by the juxtaposition of the innocent-looking doll with the devastating evidence it contained, a powerful visual representation of how appearances can be deceiving and how history's truths can remain hidden in plain sight. Perhaps the most poignant artifact is a note found among Ellen Wilson's possessions after her death, tucked inside the diary her mother had kept. Written in elderly handwriting, it reads simply, "Victoria kept our secrets until the time was right. Some truths must wait for history to be ready to hear them." The note had been written in 1980, just 2 years before Ellen's death. It suggested that she had always intended for the truth to emerge eventually, but had waited until she was sure it was safe, not just for herself, but perhaps for others involved in the story. Her decision to donate the doll to the Historical Society, with specific instructions about its display, indicated a desire to preserve the evidence without explicitly revealing its significance during her lifetime. The case has prompted historians to reconsider how many other historical photographs might contain hidden information, waiting to be revealed by modern technology. We're now developing an AI algorithm specifically designed to detect and enhance reflections in historical photographs. We believe there could be countless other images like Eleanor's, containing evidence of historical events or insights into the lives of people long gone. Every reflective surface, a window, a mirror, a pair of spectacles, or even a doll's glass eyes, could be a window into the past. The algorithm, named Reflective Evidence Finder for legacy evaluation and contextual truth, uses advanced pattern recognition to identify potential reflective surfaces in photographs, then enhances and analyzes what might be captured in those reflections. The system has already identified several promising cases in the university's photographic archives, including a 1922 wedding photograph where a mirror appears to capture a person holding what might be a weapon. The story of Eleanor and Victoria has also inspired a new approach to museum conservation, with more attention being paid to the possibility that antique toys and personal items might contain hidden compartments or secret contents. We've already discovered several other instances of objects being used to conceal items of historical significance. A Chinese puzzle box that contained revolutionary pamphlets, a teddy bear stuffed with love letters from a forbidden romance, and a hollowed-out book that held family jewelry hidden during wartime. People have always needed to hide their most precious possessions and secrets. Museums worldwide have begun implementing non-invasive scanning protocols for antique toys and personal items, searching for hidden contents without damaging the artifacts. Several significant discoveries have already been made, including coded messages hidden in a Civil War-era doll and documents concealed in the lining of a Victorian lady's writing desk. So the next time you look at an old photograph, remember that each image captures not just a moment, but potentially a mystery. Within the faded sepia tones and formal poses of the past, untold stories wait to be discovered by those willing to look closely enough. In the case of Eleanor Harrington, all it took was for someone to zoom in on a reflection in a doll's glass eyes to uncover a century-old secret of survival, reinvention, and justice long delayed. This has been Shadow Frames. Remember to like and subscribe for more hidden histories revealed through the forgotten images of the past. In our next episode, we examine a wedding photograph from 1922, where everyone is smiling, except one guest who seems to be staring directly at something off-camera. What did she see that the others didn't? And why was her name carefully scratched out of the guest book? New episodes every day.